Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to the Serving Safely, Enhancing Policing for Persons with Mental Illnesses and Developmental Disabilities webinar. All of our phone lines are currently on mute mode, so this webinar is currently being recorded. For those of you that require closed captioning for this event, please click on the link on the right-hand side of the chat box to access your closed captioning. And if you have a question for us, please type it into our Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll do our best to address your question following the presentation. We will do our best to address any of your technical issues. We will also be doing a Q&A at the end of this presentation. So as a courtesy to our presenters, we plan to keep our lines on mute for the duration of our webinar. We want to let everyone know the webinar presentation and transcript, as well as the webinar recording, will be available after the webinar today. And so without further ado, I want to kick off the webinar and welcome Leah Pope from the Vera Institute of Justice.
Good afternoon, everyone. We are so pleased to have you join us today to share more about Serving Safely, a national initiative that launched in May to improve police responses to people with mental illnesses and developmental disabilities. My name is Leah Pope. I'm a senior research fellow at the Vera Institute of Justice, and I co-direct this initiative along with my colleague, Rebecca Newstetter. I'm joined today by several colleagues and partners who I'd like to just let them introduce themselves before we get started.
Thanks, Leah. This is Melissa Roiland. I'm working with the Vera Institute of Justice now as a senior advisor. I have experience working with the Police Executive Research Forum and the Council of State Governments in the past 20 years to help police departments improve their response to people with mental illnesses. I'll turn it over to Ariel.
Hi, everyone. This is Ariel Sims. I'm the Senior Program Manager and Attorney for Criminal Justice Initiatives at ARC of the United States. ARC is the nation's largest nonprofit that advocates for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And my background before becoming an attorney and an activist was as a mental health counselor. And I'll turn it over to my colleague, Shannon.
Hi, everyone. This is Shannon Scully. I am with the National Alliance on Mental Illness, also more commonly known as NAMI. I am our Senior Manager of Criminal Justice Policy here. And NAMI, for those of you who are not as familiar, is the largest national advocacy organization that represents the interests of people living with mental illness and their family members. So glad to be here today.
Great. So our goal today is to give you an overview of this initiative and to share the types of assistance that law enforcement agencies can access. And then we'll do a deep dive into some of the work we're currently doing in the field. I just want to start by thanking the Bureau of Justice Assistance for their leadership and financial support of this work. This project really builds on their significant investments in this space, and we're very happy to be leading this. I'm going to start with a high-level overview of what Serving Safely is all about. So most importantly, for people listening in, Serving Safely is an initiative that provides free technical assistance and training to law enforcement agencies nationwide. And when we talk about law enforcement agencies, we're talking about police agencies, sheriff's offices, campus police, as well as prosecutors' offices. We do this by bringing together diverse stakeholders to work collectively to safely, appropriately, and effectively respond to people with mental illnesses and/or intellectual and developmental disabilities. And really, how we do this is by having a multidisciplinary project team composed of individuals and organizations in the field who are leaders across diverse spaces: policing, mental illness, developmental disability, crisis intervention, peer advocacy, prosecution, emergency medicine, and technology development. And in a little while, we'll share with you who our formal partners are on this work. At a high level, the initiative is pursuing a number of ambitious objectives to meaningfully contribute to the field and bring tangible benefits to law enforcement agencies. In particular, we started this work recognizing the great need to build on existing resources that serve people with mental illnesses and developmental disabilities. So I want to dig in briefly to our 4 key objectives. First, we aim to facilitate access to available training and technical assistance that enhances policing practices in this space. We know that these trainings and technical assistance resources exist, and we're looking to connect agencies to existing resources as well as build new ones. Second, we want to equip agencies as well as community service partners with tangible tools to help them respond safely to incidents and work together in their community. Third, in doing this work, we are trying to build a national community of practice, a way to lift up agencies and communities doing this work and connect them to others who can learn from their examples. And finally, all of these, we think, combine toward our efforts and VJA's goal of promoting a no wrong door approach to assistance in this space. We think this work has impact on multiple levels. We're working at a national level to ensure broad access to resources and to move the field forward in both best practice and research. But we're also working at a very local level, talking to individual agencies to understand the challenges they face and connecting them to resources and opportunities. And to describe a little bit more about how we're supporting agencies specifically, I'm going to turn it over to Melissa.
Thank you, Leah. We're going to start off by just talking a little bit more in detail about the benefits that could particularly impact your agency. And depending on your agency's needs, this could be various different impacts. So the way the process works is to hear from people and to see what they need. So some of the benefits we believe that we can bring to your agency fundamentally is some sort of support for safer interactions. We know that the police mental health collaboration programs that many of you are engaged in or hoping to become engaged in feel that safer interactions between police and people with mental illnesses or intellectual or developmental disabilities is really key to the work that you're doing. We also hope to support clear and effective communication between agencies and with the community. And we include in the community the service providers, people who provide help and resources to people with mental illnesses or developmental disabilities. And we know that communication is really the key to effective collaboration, which is really an important fundamental effort that we try to support. We also support access to tools, training, and expertise. We have, as Leah mentioned, we've cobbled together our connections to resources and hope to save agencies time by directly connecting them to resources that most meet their needs. We also have training opportunities that are available to address specific needs, and primarily we try to bring expertise to the requester. We have an enormous number of partners who bring a tremendous amount of experience to these issues, and we try to directly connect our requesters to that type of expertise. Enhanced partnerships are so critical to the effects and the impacts of these types of police mental health collaborations as they work together to divert people who have mental illness or IDD to professionals and other community supports rather than to jail whenever that is appropriate. And we provide support to those who are developing those models or who are trying to improve or enhance the models that they already have. Further, we're hoping that our TA really supports destigmatization of mental illness and IDD. We know that often the way to work that is to provide information and education and also connection to people who experience these disabilities or illnesses and really sort of break down some of those barriers to really reduce stigmatization. And lastly, we hope to support improvements in planning, deployment, tactics, and training, and any other operational priorities that agencies have. And we try to bring to that how to use data and how to improve technology to better inform those types of policies and practices. As Leah mentioned, we're working with many really critical partners in this work. Could not possibly do it without these partners. The partners are responsible for a variety of different activities in the grant. We'll just start this list as in alphabetical order. We'll start with the American College of Emergency Physicians. So this is an organization of emergency physicians that has a routine survey that goes out quarterly. And we worked with them to develop a survey to help us learn more about how emergency rooms and emergency physicians are partnering with law enforcement and others to improve sort of access to treatment and services and to improve the way situations in the emergency rooms can be, so improving safety, improving access, and dignity of treatment. Our next partner, the ARC, represented today on our call by Ariel Sims. The National Center on Criminal Justice and Disability of the ARC has worked through a BJA grant to develop pathways to justice, and Ariel's going to talk a lot more about pathways to justice, but the project is in fact providing access to this wonderful training for our requesters, for some of them. And the ARC also provides expertise through the vehicle of their local chapters, many of which are providing service to people with IDD in local communities around the country. We're partnering also with CIT International. CIT International has been spearheading the dissemination of crisis intervention teams and best practices around crisis intervention teams. They have an annual conference, which is very well attended, and they, through our grant, are providing training, as well as a tremendous amount of expertise on CIT and contacts of local CIT experts for those who are interested in local work. The National Alliance on Mental Illness, as Shannon has said, has worked tremendously in this space around how to improve police interaction with people with mental illness. For our grant, they're providing some training. They're developing some training, piloting that training, and as well providing expertise on resources and local affiliates. The National Disability Rights Network, or NDRN, is a sort of umbrella network for the advocacy protection and advocacy organizations that are legislated for each state. And these organizations support providing information about disability rights as well as representation and how best practices around representation for people with IDD and other disabilities as well. We are also working with the Police Executive Research Forum, my alma mater. PERS is going to be helping us with law enforcement executives curriculum, as well as expertise on use of force policies and their ICAT training. The Prosecutors Center for Excellence is positioned to provide expertise on best practices around prosecutions and people with mental illness and IDD. They're developing that expertise partly through some additional collaborations that we have and are actively working with us in some major district attorney's offices in the country. We have two professors that are working with us, Amy Watson through the University of Illinois at Chicago, and Michael Compton, who is currently at Columbia University. And they both have extensive experience in both researching the crisis intervention team models as well as presenting on topics related to the research of those models. And for us, they're providing expertise in evaluation design, as well as putting together a very comprehensive review of the literature and suggestions for next steps in that regard. And subject matter experts listed here are brought in based on the requests that we receive, and there's a whole host of them. We're not able to list them, but we are happy to have them involved with responding to our requests. So the Serving Safely activities, we're sort of drilling down a little bit from the kind of the overhead and the 10,000-foot view down to 1,000 feet, and I'm trying to give you a sense of kind of what it is that we're doing. There are 8 objectives in this grant, but we're only going to go over a few of them. And then 2 of our partners, the ARC and NAMI, are going to do some deep dives into the work that they're doing for serving safely. So by overview, when we talk about technical assistance, it's a pretty major piece of what we're doing. For those of you who aren't familiar with that term, it really means sort of instructions, resources, sort of fundamental information for people who are trying to do this complex work. So we assist them. It's not actually technical in nature, although some of the work we do might in fact involve technology and data. It's more sort of focused on how do we help communities achieve the goals of the police mental health collaborations, and how do we help them address challenges. So we've gotten 44 requests to date. We launched on May 1st of 2018, and these requests have kept us pretty busy. We're very, it's always thrilling when we get a new request. We're always so interested in what the field needs help with. And 38 of them, so the vast majority of them, have been from law enforcement agencies. Some of those requests have come from community partners, and what we will say to a community partner is work with your law enforcement agency or your prosecutor's office to have them complete the request. One example is Austin, Texas approached us with two questions, actually, which is why they're such a great example. The first is Austin had recently, they have a CIT program, they have a co-responder team, but they had been recently audited. There was a city audit that was produced, and there were several recommendations from the audit, and they reached out to us and said, can you help us, gain more information and more knowledge about these types of issues we need to work on. And so we were able to point them in the right direction for some resources, particularly around analyzing data and more information on co-responder teams. And then they also had been a site that had been working with the ARC and had pathways to justice training in the past. And for the request to us, they were interested in more. They just felt that it was very important that more of their officers and more of their team members get access to this important training. So the other 6 requests are from prosecution offices. Several of them are very large. New York State Attorney General's office has reached out to us for additional training. So the New York State Attorney General's office has been charged with prosecuting all cases where there's a police in custody death in the state of New York. And so they really felt that it was important to get their prosecutors and investigators in their offices more information about mental illness, about intellectual and developmental disabilities, and about what these sort of best practices, police mental health collaborations are all about. What does CIT training involve? What is a co-responder team? Because the office is also responsible for providing feedback to the agencies that are involved in these cases. So that's something that we're planning for the future. I'm going to turn it over to Leah now to talk more specifically about the training that we're offering.
Thank you, Melissa. So as we mentioned earlier, in addition to kind of this technical assistance that we offer to individual agencies that reach out to us, we also have a number of trainings that are either in development, being offered currently, or have been offered already. The first one is a law enforcement executive curriculum. We are developing with our partners a leadership training that really will work to provide law enforcement leaders, like police chiefs, with the skills and information they need to support and drive efforts in their communities. So that's something we're actively putting together now. NAMI is developing a Sharing Your Story with Law Enforcement training. Specifically, they're developing and piloting a training that will help peers and family members tell their story to a law enforcement audience. This is something that NAMI members and chapters have been already doing for many years, but having heard from so many law enforcement agencies about the impact that hearing from peers and family members makes on law enforcement officers, NAMI has now put this into a curriculum, and local NAMI affiliates are going to be able to implement this presenter program by the summer. CIT International, also one of our partners, is offering 3 different trainings. The first, crisis scenario, a train the trainer for crisis scenario training. This is often part of law enforcement training already, and so we're hoping to increase the number of facilitators who are able to train as crisis scenario trainers during basic law enforcement training. They are also offering emergency dispatcher training. So we know that 911 operators and others who work emergency dispatch lines are often fielding calls from people with mental illness or people in mental health crisis, and often providing de-escalation and then, of course, working with police officers. So this training offers them specific skills that can help them better identify when someone's in crisis and work on de-escalation in the moment. We are also offering a CIT coordinator certificate course. Again, CIT International is leading this, and this is really to train individuals who will be CIT coordinators through their community, who are either planning to or currently managing and building a CIT program. Finally, Pathways to Justice offered by the ARC is something that Ariel will talk about more in a little bit, but this is really a training that takes a multidisciplinary approach to law enforcement, legal professionals, and victim services about issues that impact people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. In addition to the training and technical assistance, as Melissa mentioned, we have a number of objectives in this initiative that we're working on actively. And I just wanted to highlight that kind of in addition to working with agencies one-on-one, we are also in the process of creating additional best practice resources that can be accessible to any agency, whether or not they get one-on-one assistance from us. Many of you may have already learned about and accessed the Police Mental Health Collaboration Toolkit, which is supported by DJA. It's a wonderful resource that already has a number of resources and tools that agencies can access. We're working on building this and also creating resources in a variety of areas, more resources around best practices, both in the mental health space as well as in the developmental disability space, and also widening the audiences that can get access to these resources, such as prosecutors and first responders. So by the end of this project, we will have a number of additional guides, webinars, research reviews, and other tools and resources that agencies can have as kind of go-to resources. So now I want to turn this presentation over to our colleagues, Shannon and Ariel, who are really leading work in the field, and they're going to dig a little bit deeper into how we're engaging community partners in this work, and how specifically NAMI and the ARC are supporting serving safely. I will turn this over to Shannon.
Thanks, Leah. Yeah, so as you are all thinking about this project and how it can be a resource for your community, Ariel and I are going to discuss a little bit how a first step that you can be taking in this project, which is really often overlooked by communities, and that is investing kind of in community partnerships. And the reason we encourage this is that, and are going to kind of dig a little deeper on this, is that we know that, or at least NAMI knows, and I know the ARC knows as well, that when we engage in this first step, communities really have a greater chance of addressing, concerns that are rising up in their communities and really meeting the needs that, their communities are expressing they have. So just to start getting you thinking, who are my community partners? And so you want to think about everyone who might be interfacing, providing services to people with mental illness or developmental disabilities. And so that includes, first and foremost, have you talked with people with mental illness and developmental disabilities in your communities? Have you talked to family members who, provide support to these folks and are kind of the primary area of support? So, you can find those through peer groups, self-advocacy groups, of people who are getting together. You can also reach out to advocacy groups such as your state or affiliate NAMI organizations or your state or local chapter of the ARC. Also your protection and advocacy organizations. These advocacy groups are really heavily connected to the people that are most impacted by our systems and are really going to have kind of their finger on the pulse of other things that, you could be doing in your community that would really kind of support and improve kind of law enforcement's response and law enforcement's interactions with people with mental health and developmental disabilities. You also want to, think about, because often these folks often see some of the other issues that might come up, are your service providers, housing and employment supports, as well as healthcare providers. And then as I mentioned before, family members and other supporters of these communities. Because they're going to be a really great source of information and, and are also going to really want to engage and invest themselves in the work that you are looking to be doing in your community. And I'm going to turn it over to Ariel, who's going to dive into a little bit more, kind of answering that question, when and why.
Thanks, Shannon. Yeah, absolutely. One of the most common questions that we get from agencies is, when should I invest in community partnerships? When should I start reaching out? And the answer is really early and often, and as soon as possible. The best way to get involved with the community is to bring them in from the start. And there's really never a wrong time, if you haven't reached out already, to really bring in those community partners. We have a saying in the disability community, nothing about us without us, which means whenever any agency or organization is doing anything, anywhere that concerns people with disabilities need to be included. And when I say included, I mean meaningfully included. So what we don't want to happen is that an agency feels like, we just need to sort of check the box and just have somebody with this type of disability or this type of lived experience at the table and we're good. That's not good enough. You really need to have people who are going to be there and participate and share with you their experiences and their different expertise. And another important point is that this does not mean just family members or other supporters. When we're talking about disability issues, you have to include people with disabilities themselves. In the mental health world, these are often called peers or people with lived experience. And then when we're talking about intellectual and developmental disability, we often use the phrase self-advocates, people who identify as having an intellectual or developmental disability and choose to advocate on that issue, both for themselves but also for others who are in similar situations. So a few examples of how you might work with your community partners. So perhaps you start a working group or a task force or a steering committee. Invite the community partners to be a part of that group, to work with you. People who are community partners can also participate in trainings. They can be trainers, of course, themselves. They can help you understand who is in your community, who the supporters are, the services out there. They can help you facilitate interactions. And they can also help you test new processes and procedures. So just another quick example, let's say you're thinking about investing in a new way for people to report victimization at your agency. Invite people with disabilities to be a part of that process, to test it out. Does it work for them, or what could you try doing differently to make sure that they're fully included? And I think the biggest point on this question of when to invest in community partnerships, please don't wait for a critical incident or something to happen, a use of force incident in your community. That's one of the worst times to then try and reach out and build these partnerships. So as much as you can, try to do it before something like that were to happen. That's not saying you can't reach out after something like that were to happen, but it's always a good idea to build those relationships now. And why is it so important to build those relationships? I mean, relationships are absolutely key in the criminal justice context. And if you are going to interact with your community, you want to have that mutual trust and you want to build mutual understanding. And community partners go a long way for that. As Shannon mentioned earlier, they can tell you about the service systems in the particular community and how they function, or perhaps how they don't function. They can tell you how people with mental health and developmental disabilities are getting caught up in the criminal justice system and how they might already be interacting with law enforcement and other criminal justice professionals. They can be a tremendous source of information and expertise for your particular agency. And then also importantly, as your agency continues to exist in the community and respond and build new programs or try new outreach strategies, your community partners can really tell you what's working and what might not be working so well. They can help you refine existing practices, procedures, and policies. And most importantly, or I think probably most interestingly to the criminal justice community, they might also be able to help you get funding and other resources to support your agency. So if you can show that you have these partnerships in place, not only getting the benefit of their expertise, you are also building really strong allies in the community, and allies that can help you. So if, let's say, a critical incident does occur, now you have those strong relationships already built, and they can help you navigate that as an agency. So with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Shannon.
Thanks, Ariel. So now we're going to just do a little bit of a deep dive into some of the work that NAMI and the ARC is doing around in our work during this project for serving safely. So like I said before, NAMI is the largest national organization that advocates and represents people living with mental illness and their family members and caregivers. We have 640 affiliates spread out across the country. And so if you are not familiar with your local NAMI, I guarantee to you that there is one in your area. And they are going to be more than happy if you reach out to them and say you would like to start working with them. And if you would like to identify where those folks are, or the closest one to you, you can go to our website at NAMI.org, and we do have a list of all of our local affiliates. So, we're committed to because our members and we, as well as us at the national office, are really committed to building those community partnerships and ensuring that, the concerns of people with mental illness and their families are really represented when trying to identify solutions and solve some of these issues that are facing our communities. So a little bit more deep diving into NAMI's work on serving safely. So we're really trying through this project to really lift up that importance of community partnerships and incorporating people with lived experience in community efforts. We definitely, with the example of how many local affiliates we have advocates in every community, and we've really worked to, and this project has really worked to engage them, to really pull from their personal experience and help that inform our training and technical assistance and all of the work that we are doing in this project. And so we'd really encourage anyone who's on, similar to as we discussed before, anyone who's on this webinar who's thinking about engaging in this work is to really think about how you can genuinely and in a meaningful way incorporate our local advocates into this work. So some of the ways that our advocates are already engaging, as Leah shared before, we are developing a curriculum that's going to support volunteers in our local affiliates to train, to put together an effective story to share with law enforcement during law enforcement training. We already have a number of NAMIs that do this for their law enforcement agencies, and we've gotten some really positive feedback, which was some of the drive that led us to creating the resources from our national office to support our affiliates. Our advocates, our members and our advocates, they have that firsthand experience, and I'm constantly learning from them about issues and things that bubble up. And so, similar to what Ariel said, we're really getting that firsthand commentary on how systems are working for people and how they may not. But there's the reason, NAMI is really there. We're there before, during, and after any changes have been made in the community. And so what I will say about my local advocates and the people that I work with on a local level and why we're working so hard to incorporate them into this work is they've really, historically, when working on some of these issues, whether it's bringing CIT to the community or really encouraging local correctional systems to figure out how to reduce the number of people with mental illness languishing in their jails, is, they're going to be that sustainability component. They're going to be there no matter what, whether there's, leadership changeover. I know that a lot of my advocates really stay in tune with that. And the second that there is a leadership changeover, whether it's a new sheriff, a new police chief, a new elected official, they're at the door and they're already expressing and talking to those people about how important these types of initiatives are in the community. And so it really does help to carry over some of that, as there is turnover, and making sure that there is consistency in the community and leadership's commitment to maintaining these changes and reforms. So, we also are, while we're working in serving safely, we're really trying to challenge people to think about going beyond training. NAMI recognizes that law enforcement has really had to step up when responding to, our national crisis dealing with mental illness. in their community. But there really is a need for comprehensive supportive services in the community. This is equally an issue that needs to be addressed by the mental health system as much as it does also need to be addressed by the law enforcement and the criminal justice system. And they really can't be doing that in a silo. And so, we really are trying to encourage that, all partners need to be at the table. You need to be thinking about including your advocacy, your mental health, your emergency services, to address, the need for better responses to these mental health crises. The more people you are including around the table, you really can start answering that question about divert to what, and kind of really helping to define what it is that, your community needs. One of the things that we are developing through this project is we are creating what we are referring to as our mental health systems blueprint that is going to start answering some of these questions. It is going to be a resource and a tool that every community is going to be able to use to identify how to fill some of these gaps that are going to help all communities divert people with mental illness away from the criminal justice system. And what we hope and inevitably it will do is reduce the amount of contact that they might have with law enforcement, or the amount of time law enforcement is spending responding to mental health crises. This is also going to help, break down some of the silos and allow people to learn from each other. And we find that, and we know this from a lot of our success stories, and we hear this all the time from the folks in the community, is that when people start seeing this as a group effort, as something that everyone needs to be involved in, that there are really just some better outcomes for our folks and for people with mental health concerns. So if you have more questions about NAMI or how your local NAMI might be able to be involved in your work, or how we're involved in Serving Safely, you can always contact Serving Safely, the initiative at www.servingsafely.org. But you can also reach out to NAMI directly. We're at cit@nami.org, or you can follow us at NAMI Advocacy, just to kind of stay in touch with what it is we are doing. And now I'm going to turn it over to Ariel to talk a little bit more about the ARC.
Thanks, Shannon. So what I'm about to describe with the ARC is going to sound very similar to what you just heard Shannon describe with NAMI. Our organization started in very similar ways and have grown in very similar ways. So sometimes it might be even just easier to think about, these two different organizations out there. But at our heart, we support different kinds of disabilities. So the ARC itself was founded back in the 1950s, and it was really started by family members of students with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And at that time, if you had a child with a disability, you were told to put them into an institution and just leave them there and then go home and take care of the rest of your family. And the parents and family members in the 50s started to say, you know what, we don't want to institutionalize our kids anymore. We want them to be at home. We want them to be in their communities. And since that time, the ARC has grown immensely. So now, today, we have about 650 state and local chapters located all across the U.S. So, as Shannon was saying, chances are you have a NAMI affiliate near you. Chances are you also have a chapter of the ARC near you. At the local level, our chapters tend to be service providers, or sometimes they also provide advocacy, and so they will directly support people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And at the state level, our state chapters tend to do state-level advocacy. And then the ARC of the United States, which is the National Office of the ARC and the direct partner on the Serving Safely project, we do advocacy at the national/federal levels and also support our chapter network. So specifically, we're with the National Center on Criminal Justice and Disability, and our role on Serving Safely is really to provide subject matter expertise on intellectual and developmental disability and what that looks like in the criminal justice context. Of course, with police, this is really about, promoting TPA for law enforcement agencies, but also with the broader criminal justice system and what that can look like. And you might be wondering, what are developmental disabilities? So I'll just give you a very quick definition. Developmental disabilities are typically disabilities that start during someone's youth and childhood, so the developmental period, and then they expand across that person's lifespan. So just a quick definition there in case people were wondering. Happy to answer more questions about that later. Specifically for this particular project, in addition to providing general subject matter expertise on intellectual and developmental disability, we're also participating in many training and technical assistance requests. We are contributing to an overall research agenda for the field, trying to identify those unanswered questions and also the data that we're really missing from the field that would really help criminal justice professionals do their jobs and do them successfully. And we're also contributing to the law enforcement executives curriculum that was mentioned earlier by Melissa and Leah. And then finally, we're also doing webinars for the field. Of course, we're on this webinar today, but there will also be an upcoming webinar more targeted to law enforcement agencies that describes intellectual and developmental disabilities and what law enforcement officers need to know. And doing the same thing for prosecutors, what prosecutors really need to know about intellectual and developmental disabilities in their profession. So a little bit more history about the National Center on Criminal Justice and Disability, or NCCJD for short. We were created back in 2013 when we got our first grant from the Bureau of Justice Assistance. And at that time, the Bureau of Justice Assistance said, we need to have some kind of entity that exists and can sit between the criminal justice community on the one hand and the intellectual and developmental disability community on the other, because we know these two communities are not really communicating with one another, not always understanding each other. And so we came into existence and we advocated that intersection of criminal justice reform, but also advocating and advancing disability rights. The other really interesting thing about our center is that we don't focus on sort of just one side of the system, if you will. We know that people with disabilities get involved in the criminal justice system in a variety of ways, and we want to be responsive to that. So we know that people with disabilities can be victims of crime. We know that they can be suspected of crimes and be a defendant moving through the criminal justice process. And we know people can be incarcerated or even a witness to something that happened in the community. So our role is really to provide expertise on all of the ways that people with disabilities can interact with the criminal justice system. And we do that through a few different activities. So first, we do training and technical assistance for all kinds of criminal justice professionals. So we don't support sort of just any one profession. Anybody who works in the system can reach out to us for TTA. The most common requests we get are typically from defense attorneys, but we've also supported law enforcement officers, prosecutors, forensic interviewers, community corrections personnel, kind of you name it. People who work in the system have reached out to us for assistance at one time or another. On the flip side of that, we provide information and referrals directly to people with disabilities and their family members and supporters. So sometimes people don't know what to do when they get caught up in the criminal justice system. They're not sure what it means to have a disability or an intellectual and developmental disability specifically in the criminal justice system and how that will impact the process. So we can help them, give them some basic information about what to expect and what kinds of things might happen as they move through the process. We also do a lot of resource creation, collection, and education, basically trying to educate the field more generally about best practices in identifying intellectual and developmental disability and supporting people with disabilities through the process, and for criminal justice professionals specifically, making sure they really understand their legal obligations toward the disability community so they can avoid any complaints around discrimination. And then specifically through this program, we're offering Pathways to Justice. I want to tell you a little bit more about sort of our signature program. Pathways to Justice is really a comprehensive community-based program that is designed to improve access to justice for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in the criminal justice system and however they're going through that. And as I mentioned earlier, as part of the disability community, we always really care about nothing about us without us. So we work alongside people with disabilities to do this program. In addition to being community-based, it's also multidisciplinary, as Leah mentioned earlier. We don't just support law enforcement officers. We think everybody needs to have a seat at the table, so we bring all the different groups together. And really at its heart, it's relationship-oriented. We really think it's key to form relationships, both within the criminal justice community. Law enforcement needs to understand prosecutors and defense attorneys and victim services professionals but also cross the disability community. They need to understand the disability community, and the different parts of the disability community also needs to understand each other. So relationships are really a key part. So pathways can be broken out into 3 different steps. And the first step is to create what's called a Disability Response Team, or DRT. And basically, this is our way of bringing together all the key stakeholders from the criminal justice community on the one hand, with the key stakeholders from the disability community on the other. So we get all of these folks around the table and starting to talk to one another. And sometimes it's the first time that there's been a conversation between a criminal justice entity and a disability entity. But we get them together and really get that kind of conversation started about what are the issues in this particular community, what's going on, what's really important, and what needs to be addressed. Once that disability response team is formed, experts from the National Center on Criminal Justice and Disability, we come into that community and we partner with the disability response team to deliver an 8-hour training for criminal justice professionals. And our target audiences include law enforcement, legal professionals, and victim services providers. So again, we're really trying to touch a lot of different pieces of the criminal justice process because we think it all works together along with the disability service system to support people who might get otherwise caught up in the system. So after that 8-hour training, people have, heard about sort of the basics of intellectual and developmental disability. They have a better understanding of their basic legal obligations when interacting with the disability community. And now they better learn to identify people with disabilities and more effectively communicate and support them through the criminal justice process. And at the end of the training day, we come back together and we kind of ask the now what question. And together as a community, we start to brainstorm what can we do differently moving forward to make sure that the system is working the way it should be working for everybody, and that includes people with disabilities. Once the training is over with, we kind of pass the reins back to the disability response team, and their job is to continue being that kind of go-to resource in that community on criminal justice and disability issues. And at the national level, at the National Center, we continue to provide technical assistance and support and kind of help in any way that we can, but we really think that true reform happens at the community level and between those key partners. So we can provide support, but really kind of taking a step back and leaving it in the hands of the community. So with that, I am going to turn things back over to Leah to talk a little bit more about how specifically you can engage with serving safely.
Great. Thank you, Ariel. So we are going to open it up for questions in a few moments, but we just wanted to give people some concrete guidance around how you can engage with our initiative and with our really deep group, our deep knowledge through our extensive group of partners. The first way is to request free assistance online. You can go to our request form and fill it out. It is very easy. I will explain a little bit more about that in a minute. You can also access our website. Serving Safely website is servingsafely.org, and on this website you'll learn a little bit more about the project. Much of what we've covered here today. You can dig down into some resources, and you can request assistance. You can get access to the training and technical assistance request form. So what does requesting assistance look like? We have been very intentional about creating a low bar to get in touch with us. So you're, of course, always welcome to email us directly, but we do have all people requesting assistance go through a brief form to give us a little bit more information about the nature of your request and the resources you're looking for. And this helps keep us organized and also allows us to prepare a little bit. Once you fill out the form, which should only take a matter of minutes and can be requested and can be filled out by anyone in a law enforcement agency, our team at Vera reviews the form and sets up a call with you and your agency to discuss a little bit more about the nature of your request and to really dig into the challenges you're facing, the types of resources you're looking for, et cetera. based on that initial call, we then talk with our extensive team of partners. We have a committee that triages all calls, and we make recommendations about possible ways to move forward, whether it's through training, through on-site or through virtual assistance, through sending you resources, or any other of the services we offer. Often it will involve matching you with one or several of our partners who can best assist you. And so sometimes this is one call, sometimes this is a call followed up with information that we send to you, followed by another call. It really depends on the needs of your community, the extent to which you have time available to expend on different trainings or resources, or developing community partnerships. And how we can best serve you. So it's really community specific. But we encourage you to fill out the form. It is quite easy, and you can go from there. Lastly, I'll just put up on the slides our contact information. You can go to servingsafely.org, as I mentioned, or you can also email us directly at servingsafely@vera.org. Thank you so much. Now I would like to turn it back over to NTAC, who will help guide us through answering questions that we can field through our Q&A box.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists today for a very informative presentation. And so, as mentioned, we have reached the Q&A portion of our presentation today. As I mentioned before, all of our lines are currently on mute mode, and we want to give everyone a moment to ask their questions. So if you have a question, please type it in using our chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. And as a reminder, the webinar presentation, the transcript, and a recording will be available after this webinar. For the purpose of this portion of the webinar, I'll go ahead and go through some of the questions and read them out loud for our audiences, and then we'll have our panelists respond. So I do see a few questions that are coming in. So we do have a question. The first question is, how do you all engage police who seem unwilling to engage?
So, Tanya, it's Melissa Roiland. I will go ahead and take a stab at that. It's not easy, right? But I guess when I try to think about, when we talk about police as a big group, it's hard to imagine. It feels very like in a distance from us that they're very different. They're often very difficult, certainly when they're trying to pull you over for a parking violation or a speeding violation. And what I try to encourage people to do is sort of break it down. And all you need to do is find one police officer who seems willing to engage. And sometimes you can build from that one relationship. And many police departments have community policing units or other sort of community-focused officers, community liaisons, that sort of thing. And you might be able to start in your agency to identify which officers have sort of been tasked with being a liaison with the community on broader issues, right? So it would be to reach out and say, I'm not making a complaint. I am trying to work to identify some help in my, or you can ask for a police officer to come and speak at a group meeting. There's generally a police officer who's available to do that. And then it's about building relationships and getting to know the person who's the police officer so that the police officer can get to know the person or the individuals who have disabilities or their family members and loved ones. I think when we sort of make it a monolith like the police, I think we don't necessarily recognize how many different individual officers there are who have, many of whom even have family members who have a mental illness or who have a disability. A disability, that they are, have personal experience. And oftentimes it's those officers who take up the charge in the agency to make changes. Does anyone else want to jump in on that one?
This is Ariel with the ARC. So I would also say that sometimes you can't necessarily reach out to the policing agency directly, and it might be even better to reach out to other community organizations, those partners that we were mentioning earlier, Shannon and I. And sometimes, for police, it could be a variety of reasons that they're not necessarily sort of responsive to this. It could be that they did have a recent incident, and maybe now they're facing even legal action or investigation by the Department of Justice. That's a very intimidating process. Or it just could be that maybe they're not feeling quite ready as an organization or as an agency to do this. It also really depends on who is reaching out to them. We found in our work, it can be a little bit more intimidating for a national organization to try and reach out and offer support. Sometimes it's better coming from another local organization or entity. So we'll often encourage our chapters of the ARC, for instance, to make some connections and try to establish a preliminary relationship with a policing agency in their community. And it can be something small as saying, hey, if any of your officers are interested in learning more about developmental disabilities, we'd like you to offer to come and visit our chapter and learn more about what we do here. So sometimes it can be something as small as just that gesture to get the relationship started.
Just kind of adding on to that, and these are very NAMI-specific examples, but we have a program called NAMI Walks, which raises awareness about mental illness in communities. Local NAMIs will host walks at various points throughout the year, and it's a huge community event, and we've actually had NAMIs reach out to law enforcement agencies as they've reached out to other local businesses and engaged them in forming a team. And something that this has done both, it's opened that door for them to, get to know the local NAMI, start thinking about some of those mental health issues, but also thinking about officer wellness. And so that's been another way that, some of our NAMIs have engaged local law enforcement that has also led to kind of more of this, side of, actually implementing training, implementing different policies and procedures.
Thank you for the response. I have another question that just came in. The question is, do you have involvement with pretrial service programs in the state of Utah?
So this is Melissa. Leah, do you want to address that?
Sure. So currently we do not have involvement with any pretrial services agencies in the state of Utah or any other states for that matter. We are actually my colleagues are in Utah today doing emergency dispatcher training. But to date we have not had anyone reach out from pretrial services and that's not to say that we couldn't work with them, but because we are really focused on law enforcement, we haven't engaged the court specifically unless we are working with the prosecutor's office as part of that.
Thank you. The next question is, how do you ensure that as national organizations you aren't going against the wishes of members of the local community? Even if some disability groups, such as NAMI, prefer to work with the police, many disability groups are abolitionists. How do you balance?
Shannon, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I can, definitely. And I will say, at least at NAMI, and I know Ariel and I have had this conversation a lot because our networks are so similar. We do work really hard to stay connected to our local NAMI. I think most of the conversations Melissa and I have are, well, who's their local NAMI and have they reached out to them? We really do try through this project and through my work at NAMI to really refer back to the local organization. But NAMI is a network and we are guided by common policy principles and practices, which really do help in our advocacy work. And, a principle that, a lot of the NAMIs work on, under is really kind of engaging with the community to kind of solve a lot of these pressing issues. So I don't know if I've ever run into heavy conflict because I do try to keep those channels open, and I really do try to defer mostly to our local organizations as much as I possibly can. Ariel, do you have anything to kind of add to that?
Yeah, this is Ariel. I would echo what you just said, Shannon, that, you know, in the same way that NAMI works closely with its affiliates, we work closely with our chapters of the ARC in these local communities. And our Pathways to Justice program in particular is designed to be a good fit at the community level. And really, we understand our role to be a facilitator, somebody on the outside who can maybe come in and provide a little bit of expertise, a little bit of guidance, but at the end of the day, it's that community that's coming together and deciding what they want to do about a particular situation. And I understand, you know, the second part of the question being about abolition of police agencies, and there are certainly disability groups out there that have advocated for this. And, you know, that certainly could be one type of solution, but again, our focus is on respecting what the community wants to see happen in that community. It hasn't come up yet where a community has come together and they've decided that's sort of the best option. Most people kind of conclude that policing is here to stay. So what can we do to work together and make systems work better that would be very, very difficult to disentangle and sort of destroy instead of working within them. So again, our role is really to be sort of a facilitator to provide some expertise and guidance based on best practices that have emerged from all over the United States, but then to really leave it in the hands of the community to decide how to move forward and how they want their community to work moving forward.
Thank you. So another question that I have is, have any of our presenters today worked with the law enforcement office agency model where they have social workers or other liaisons on call law enforcement officers during calls for service with someone with disabilities or mental disabilities?
I'm sorry. I'm trying to find that question, Tanya, and I don't see it. Can you read that again?
Sure. This one was sent to me directly, and the question is, have any of the presenters worked with the law enforcement office agency model where they have social workers or other liaisons on call, law enforcement officers during calls for service with someone with disabilities or mental disabilities?
So in the work that I've done on the law enforcement response to people with mental illnesses, there is a kind of model that we talk about called a co-responder model, where a law enforcement agency works with a social worker, and there's a variety of different ways that they can collaborate together. In some cases, the social worker, and this is really a mental health expert, person with crisis intervention training, but on the mental health side, they either work in the police department and they get called to go out on cases involving someone who is in crisis. Some of these individuals ride along with the police officers so they can really respond in a more timely way. And some of them work with police departments in a more kind of case management way, where there's a collaborative group that comes together and talks about certain individuals who may be coming to the attention of police repeatedly, who might need a more customized sort of response. I'm not aware, well, and that's not true. So increasingly, people with lived experience or people who are self-advocates are working with police departments to assist in helping people that they encounter, but I don't know that, I'm not aware of any, and maybe others are, of someone with lived experience or who is an advocate who is like co-responding to the scene. That's not to say that some mental health professionals are not also people with lived experience, or that police officers are not also. But I think that's what the question is getting at. Does anybody else have any other thoughts on that, on the panel?
This is Shannon. I think there are some communities in Colorado that use peer advocates. I think that's what they're getting at. They use peer advocates that kind of go out in the co-responder model, but I do know that it's in a very limited situation. And I'm not sure whether that model has spread anywhere, but I have encountered at least one in Colorado that does that.
Okay, I hope that's helpful. I wasn't familiar with the law enforcement agency, like that terminology at the beginning. So I hope I haven't mischaracterized.
And this is Ariel. I would just add that I think we're also seeing the rise of justice centers and sort of respite centers, basically places where if law enforcement is responding to an individual with a mental health or developmental disability, places that they can take them in the community that's not jail or a hospital. And then what we're seeing is these different community groups and service providers coming together in one place so that they can support people and, you know, depending on the kind of disability they might have, get them connected with services and supports or whatever else they might need. In some places, they're even, you know, connecting people to housing services and other supports.
Yeah, and I would just finally add, I think all of these answers kind of point to this idea that as part of this work, we are really agnostic about approach, and by that I mean that we work with communities to determine and understand the resources they currently have and what works best for them in their community. So some communities may have crisis intervention teams and they want to add a co-responder model. In some places, crisis intervention team might not make sense, but a mobile crisis team might make sense. And so it's really about thinking about what are the available models, and as we gather more research on those models, what works best for the community.
Thank you. The next question I have is, how does the lack of people who are available to work in these professions and the high turnover rates affect the resources you are able to provide to police and first responders who are often working 16-hour, 24-hour, or 30-hour shifts?
Leah, do you want to tackle that?
Yep, sorry, I was on mute. If you could repeat the question for me.
Yes. Hold on one second. The question is, how does the lack of people who are available to work in these professions and the high turnover rates affect the resources you're able to provide to police and first responders who are often working 16 hours, 24-hour, or 30-hour shifts?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's a challenge the entire field faces, and of course is not unique to policing, but also the healthcare field and other fields. I think that, you know, it's something, I think there are a number of ways that we are thinking about this issue. First is that, you know, at the very top, as part of our law enforcement executive curriculum, for example, part of what we're trying to do is really have leadership understand these issues and change the culture of their organization so that they're responding to people with mental illnesses and developmental disabilities in safe and appropriate ways. And I think having leadership and buy-in from the top is really critical in kind of creating those practices that go throughout the agency so that even if there is turnover, those values remain. I think another way that we're thinking about this issue is offering training and technical assistance to a variety of players. So, for example, the 911 dispatcher training. You know, we think it's critical that police get tools, but that other first responders get tools as well. So really, if you think about an entire community interacting, and that's really, again, why it's so critical that these are thought of as police mental health collaborations, where it's not just the police who have been trained or are working together, but police working with community partners, so that there are multiple individuals in any community, multiple agencies who are both aware of the challenges in their community and actively thinking about resources that they can connect people to. So, you know, but we're very aware that this is a challenge, and we hope that our work over time really becomes embedded in the culture of policing organizations and community collaboration.
Thank you. The next question is there any intention by any of these entities to include the criminal defense community in these efforts?
Ariel, do you want to take that?
Yeah, absolutely. So criminal defense attorneys are a big part of the Pathways to Justice program. And it's one of the reasons that we kind of take a broader approach. And when we come into a community, we want to try to get in touch with as many stakeholders as we can. And the defense community is a big part of that, and so are prosecutors. So when we do Pathways, we continue to invite the defense community to participate in that. We have a separate module that's meant for legal professionals during the training day itself. And in that particular module, we have defense attorneys working alongside prosecutors and judges and sometimes court personnel and kind of support staff to problem solve some of these issues that come up in the courtrooms and in the legal process that they're seeing and what they're trying to handle and interact with. So absolutely, we think criminal defense attorneys are definitely a part of this, and of course, they are often, especially if we're talking about public defenders, they're often representing our communities, people with disabilities who also tend to be living in poverty, so much more likely to be representing those types of individuals. More broadly speaking, in our program, the National Center on Criminal Justice and Disability, we continue to provide technical assistance to these professionals even outside of the Serving Safely initiative. So please feel free to reach out to us for technical assistance or support. And I put an email in the chat box earlier. It's just NCCJD info@thearc.org if you need to get in touch.
Thank you. We had a question about the Austin initiative that you mentioned earlier. Do you think you can expand on that?
Sure. So when the Austin Police Department called us, they did request some assistance just looking through the audit report that had been prepared for them, and we reviewed some resources that we might have for them to address specific issues, as I mentioned earlier, ways to use data, and we are going to include them in some co-responder conversations that we hope to be having. And then in addition, we're going to be presenting our Pathways to Justice training. So that wasn't in direct relationship to the audit report, if I had that correct. That was just an extension of the work that Austin had already been doing with their disability community. And if you have further questions about what's happening in Austin, we could connect you with the person we're working with there. So feel free to send an email. That would be to the servingsafely@vera.org. And you can just direct the email to Melissa, and I will contact you offline.
Thank you. Just a reminder, we might not be able to get to everyone's question today, and we will be sending out the slides following this webinar. And the contact information is available on the screen right now. But we are still here to take a few more questions. So, all right. One of the questions is related to expanding work with other groups, including the LGBT community, and I think it's POC stands for people of color, and so there's definitely need for training with these historically marginalized groups. And the question is, to what extent have you engaged such groups that lead disability organizations in developing these strategies?
I think that's a very good question, and I can't speak to that directly, but perhaps Ariel or Shannon can talk about how they have worked with these groups.
Yeah, this is Ariel. It's a really important question, and it's also so critical because we know that people with disabilities, while representing sort of one marginalized community, often have other identities and intersecting identities that could experience multiple marginalization. And we know that other communities often have higher rates of disability, people of color, people who are members of the LGBTQIA+ community. So we're very cognizant of these issues. We've been working on the national level to be more intersectional in our advocacy and our approach, generally speaking. And we've focused recently on policing issues and how do we bring together the different advocacy groups that work on these issues. But what tends to happen is we have a disability group over here and a racial justice group over there, and often they're not communicating with each other. So last year, actually, I think 2017 now, we did a series on how to do intersectional advocacy when it comes to policing in particular. So we have some webinars available on our website, www.drg.org/NCCJD. So you can check those out. You can email us. I'm happy to send you the direct link to those webinars. And we partnered with other organizations to really tackle that issue of intersectionality, specifically in policing. It's also something we spend a lot of time talking about in Pathways to Justice. When we first come in to do the training for criminal justice professionals, we start off in the morning by talking about, like, we're here to focus on disability, but it's rare to just talk about disability in isolation. We have to acknowledge that people have other identities, and that, this is a very diverse community. And we also put out, reports and share information about how this can impact people moving through the criminal justice process. So, for example, there was a really interesting study that came out in 2017 about the rates of arrest, and I don't think anyone is surprised that people with disabilities were more likely to be arrested. People of color with disabilities were even more likely to be arrested, and male people of color with disabilities were the most likely to be arrested, even before age 28. So we're starting to see more resources in the field, more research on this particular issue, and it's something that we're constantly striving for at our level of trying to be more intersectional and thoughtful in our approach and reaching out to these other organizations.
I'll just add kind of on to, what NAMI has done, specifically at the intersection of, people of, law enforcement and how they address, people of color, LGBTQ, and those who might have, mental illness. It's always really difficult, I think. At the national level, we partner with the NAACP to really kind of address this issue, but I think, there's challenges to merging those worlds, which I think Ariel really commented on, is that we tend to work in silos and by ourselves. Outside of the criminal justice world, NAMI works a lot to just raise awareness in communities, and I think what I know from the folks at NAMI National's office who are working on these issues is that, everybody understands mental illness in a different way, and communities talk about it in a different way. And so we do a lot of advocacy to encourage that service providers are being culturally competent, and so that they can help folks identify and understand mental illness when the symptoms do arise in them. We do have a program that's called Sharing Hope that really does reach out to the Latino community and kind of meets that community where they're at in terms of understanding mental illness. We also do a lot of work in faith communities, which was really spearheaded by communities of color who are involved in NAMI and felt that, the faith community was a central place in their local community to where they could meet people and educate people about getting assistance and support for mental illness. So not specifically at the intersection of law enforcement, but there are efforts that are happening in communities. And with our local NAMIs, they're reaching out to other groups. And so I think just in saying this, it shows how important it is to really kind of engage with your larger community, because I think it's a challenge for us to solve some of these issues at the national level, and it's really going to be local organizations that are looking at, making those links, so if there's a local NAMI that's really working with the Latino community, they're able to link it to some of the work they're probably doing with law enforcement and getting law enforcement to think about, how are you addressing this particular intersection in your work. So I think it's really important that you're thinking broadly about who your partners are and who's in your community and might care about this issue, because it is going to help your local community address some of these intersections and the needs of a lot of these communities.
Thank you very much. We have about 10 more minutes, and I do have a few more questions. The question is, are there any models for a go-between type of facility for people when jail is not appropriate, but the hospital won't keep that person, and the person is not in a situation where they're not safe to go home?
So this is Melissa. And I think Ariel might have mentioned this in one of her responses. There are different types of what they're calling crisis response centers, right? CRCs is one of the terms that's being used. And they're definitely set up to help people who have mental illness or substance use disorders, or I assume someone who has an IDD, but I haven't looked into that. Where police officers can bring those individuals instead of taking them to the hospital, because for a long time, right, we talked about diverting from jail, and now we're talking about diverting from hospital because we know that in many cases the hospital is not the right place for someone who's in crisis. And these crisis stabilization centers sometimes have things called 23-hour beds so that they don't have to comply with certain types of legislative regulations that apply to hospitals. And often, most of the time, they are voluntary. People have to be interested and willing to stay, but they're staffed by a range of types of people with expertise. So some of them, you might have a psychiatrist, you might have psychiatric nursing, as well as counseling, as well as peers, as well as social workers that can do, kind of resource development with folks to help them if they're having trouble with housing or food insecurity or homeless. We have an expert on our project, one of our consultants. Her name is Margie Balfour, and she, reflects on her experience in Arizona setting up these types of centers herself as a physician, as a psychiatrist, and working to make sure that, they're integrally connected to the law enforcement response as well as to hospitals, right? So sometimes there's in-reach in hospitals now with some of these centers to say, come on, you can send them to us and we'll manage, whatever kind of behavior seems to be happening. But they're expensive. We've had a couple of folks call and talk to us about that they're getting a crisis response center, and they're going to be, as kind of filling in that gap. And it can take years to put something like that together. But I think it's really critical to whether these types of community-based programs can work. Does anybody else have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, Melissa, this is Shannon. Arlington County, Virginia has a really good model for this, because I know that we often lift up Tucson, and Tucson's great, but they do have some very particular funding streams and some almost a perfect storm that I feel like happened and that allowed them to create that. But Arlington is another example, and I do know that the state of Minnesota passed a bonding bill and made available funds to be able to create infrastructure, essentially, like that building, that physical building, which I think is that really initial challenge to kind of creating some of these things, is having a location. So we are starting to see a lot more around the country, and I think it's something that's very exciting, because I agree with a lot of the comments that are being said kind of in the chat box here that, families are constantly being faced, people with mental illness are constantly being faced with the choice of jail or sitting in a hospital, and the hospitals are asking people, are not keeping people as long as they need to be kind of held. And so I think that these crisis centers are really an opportunity for us to provide, in the community, some supportive services for people not in a criminal justice setting.
And
absolutely. And do you see the question, Ariel, about whether there's crisis response centers for people with IDD?
I did see that. I think the question is specifically about Austin. I'm not aware of this type of center in Austin for people with IDD. The one that I'm familiar with, I believe, is in Colorado. But I also wanted to mention that we're also seeing the rise of kind of family support networks. So families who reside in the same community, who know each other because they're maybe all connected to their local chapter of the ARC or to their NAMI affiliate, are actually sort of relying on each other when things are happening with family members. So they're not even calling the police to start with. And then I also heard about a really interesting program in New York that's run by peers, so people with mental health disabilities, and they basically have apartments set up that are kind of safe spaces for people to go if they feel like they're experiencing a crisis and they're concerned about being taken to a hospital or interacting with law enforcement. It's an alternative place for them to go, and then the environment is set up exactly like you would expect an apartment to be. So it's very homey, and doesn't look like a hospital in any way, shape, or form. But then there are trained peer advocates on site to help support people. So I think that's also a really interesting model, and I think to go back to the earlier point about, some groups are advocating just kind of circumventing the police to start with, that we might also continue to see the rise of these sort of family and inter-community support networks, and also peer and self-advocate-led support services.
I think we have time for one more question. The question is Pathways to Justice only available through a request to Serving Safely? And if not, how else could someone request it for their community? There's another question to this. Can a request be initiated by, for example, a local ARC chapter or similar agency?
So the short answer to that is absolutely. You can reach out to us about Pathways. You don't have to necessarily go through Serving Safely. So Serving Safely is our primary way of funding Pathways to Justice at the moment. But please feel free to reach out to us. So if you're interested in Pathways, and whether you are a chapter of the ARC or another community group, or you are a law enforcement agency or a prosecutor's office or a public defender's office, whoever you are, if you're interested in Pathways to Justice, send me an email at the NCCJD info@thearc.org, and I will follow up with you. I'll tell you more about the program. I will learn more about your specific kind of training needs or your concerns about what's going on in your particular community, and then I can help you identify sort of the right path to bringing Pathways to you. So please do reach out. Happy to chat more about it.
Thank you so much, and I want to thank everyone for participating in the webinar today. So since we run out of time for questions, I do want to wrap up, and I want to let everyone know that we'll send a follow-up email with a copy of today's presentation along with the webinar transcript. The webinar recording will also be available to you all, and in our email we will try to address any questions that didn't get answered today, and I know there were quite a few questions. So I also wanted to share that the email will include a questionnaire for those who attended the webinar, and we encourage you to participate once we send that out. But I would like to thank all of our panelists today and to everyone who joined us, and this concludes our webinar presentation. Please enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you.